Hello, this is Dr. Carney, and this is an Introduction to Literary Theory and Criticism Part 2. And a lot of this material is coming from Ann H. Stevens' Literary Theory and Criticism, an introduction, the second edition, about the second third of the introduction. The first chapter is about 50 pages long, so we're covering about 20 pages in the middle of that first chapter. So I want to start with the academic study of literary theory and backlash. So we talked about the distinction between literary criticism and literary theory in the first lecture, so we have a good working understanding of how those two enterprises are different. So now I want to talk about how literary theory was established as a distinctive academic discipline. And Stevens says, by the 1990s, a course covering literary theory became a standard part of many undergraduates and graduate students' training, either as a standalone course or as a unit within an introductory course or courses. Academic conferences and journals devoted specifically to literary theory proliferated. And that's very true. I was an undergraduate and I was an English major in, my freshman year was 2001. And I believe that my sophomore year, 2002, I took a course in literary theory. It was a 200 level course. And I remember my professor saying this was a very new class. So in my undergraduate, the idea that undergraduate English majors would be taking a course in theory was still relatively new. But it was a great experience. The textbook was, a lot of people have used it at this point, Lois Tyson, and it used F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, and there were chapters on different literary theories, and each chapter applied that literary theory to The Great Gatsby. But eventually theory becomes an academic discipline. But there was also a backlash against theory, and Ann Stevens cites two specific texts. The first one was this Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind, the New York Times Book Review, an unparalleled reflection on today's intellectual and moral climate, the rarest of documents, a genuinely profound book. And I haven't read Bloom, but Stevens says that it's a critique of theory as cultivating moral relativism. So I guess theory causes moral relativism. We'll talk about that. I think there is something to say about that idea. Theory definitely subjects any sort of ideas that we take as for granted to analysis. Right? No idea is sacred from the point of view of the theorist. The theorist is going to analyze any sort of preconceived notions that we have, and maybe that is this threatening. This idea that no idea is just going to be accepted without much thought. It goes back to it's a basic premise of philosophy is that everything needs to be examined, everything needs to be subjected to examination. Some people would say that's a kind of transgressive. There's a violation that's happening. There's certain ideas that we should just accept. In one way of characterizing the enterprise of theory using broad strokes is that it doesn't accept that idea. She also cites this E.D. Hirsch Jr. book, Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know. And once again, I haven't read this one, but she talks about it as this conservative argument that literary theory has caused people who study literature to no longer focus on literature. The subject of inquiry, Homer, Milton, Shakespeare, we're reading Mary Shelley in this class, right? The actual, literary art is no longer being focused on. What's being thought about are these post-structuralist philosophers, Derrida, Michel Foucault, all of those figures. So Hirsch is part of this. We need to redirect our attention to literature as such. Some concerns there that we'll explore later in the class because, going back to the first lecture, this idea of an immutable literary canon, this curated list of valuable works that I think would premise an argument like Hirsch's, it has some problems. Who's determining what the canon is? Who's an authority to determine what works are worth our attention, worth rereading? She talks about some less dramatic responses to theory, an emphasis on historical studies, abstract philosophizing, focusing on texts as linguistic structures, not connected to the real. This one of the ways of responding to that is emphasizing how actually texts are conditioned by their historical moment. There are actually artifacts, right? So print culture, how was this thing published and disseminated? History of the book. And then there was this emphasis on clarity in academic writing. Academic writing in the period of high theory, and that's not a very technical term. Maybe some people would say that's the 80s, early 90s. High theory became very technical and insular in its style. It was only it was written. I shouldn't say it's only written for technicians, but clearly a lot of that work was written with this informed and educated audience in mind, and that seems to be an issue with the humanities. The humanities scholar, I think it's fair to say, should be able to talk to humans, not just the initiated. So that's the consolidation of an academic study of literary theory and a backlash. I think the backlash is still going on today, and we can see it in some of these hoaxes that have taken place. Stevens doesn't talk about these hoaxes, but one that I want to bring up is the Sokal hoax. In 1996, a physics professor, Alan Sokal, published an article in the leading journal of literary theory, Social Text, and it was titled "Transgressing the Boundaries Toward a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity." And Sokal argues that gravity was a social construct. I haven't read the article, but it's kind of a silly claim. Gravity, this fundamental force in classical physics, is a social construct. It's not real. It was published, and then Sokal revealed it to be a hoax in May of 1996. One of the things that it really got us thinking about as literary scholars. By the way, I was 13 years old then, so I wasn't really thinking about this. But what it got literary scholars thinking about is their competency to incorporate science into their scholarly enterprises. Right? Like, are we our literary scholars the right people to be commenting on quantum mechanics? Maybe not. And this continues today with. In 2017, 2018, three academics, Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose, submitted over 20 articles that promoted deliberately absurd ideas and morally questionable acts, and many of them were published, and many of them were, accepted but not published, and only a few, 6, had been rejected by the time they revealed that they were hoaxing everyone. So this idea of theory as being this, we all know the story of the emperor's new clothes. Like, there's some pushback against theory that some of this theorizing is excessive and maybe absurd. We'll talk more about that. Perhaps some of the lines of thought that are explored in theory do satisfy the conditions for absurdity, right? Like, is there a point where theory becomes, excessive and no longer useful? Maybe, maybe not. And what is practical criticism is an important question that we'll talk about in when we get to, there's actually a school of literary criticism called practical criticism founded by I.A. Richards that maybe will allow us to answer these questions in a more substantive way. So there's a story of theory progressing, emerging in the 1960s, becoming a cohesive academic discipline in the 1980s, and this backlash. Nowadays, people are starting to talk about after theory or post-theory. Maybe we've started to move beyond theory in literary studies. And just a couple of scholars that I think, this is a purely personal opinion, I think is an example of moving beyond theory are, first is Rita Feltsky, who wrote a book, The Uses of Literature, in 2008, and then later The Limits of Critique in 2015. Feltsky, she, what I think is really memorable about the uses of literature and the limits of critique combined is that critiquing literature, trying to probe its depths, deconstructing it, working against it, the intellectual enterprise of like a Marx or um, Freud, right? There's the manifestation of the text, but that it doesn't really mean what we think it means. We need to to go back to that analogy of the oracle speaking in riddles, that we need to interpret it. That's only one way of relating to literature. There are other uses of literature, not just this critique and trying to find hidden depths. She makes a lot of moves in her books, but one of the moves that I think is really memorable is the joy of recognition, of experience. A lot of times when we're reading deeply, we're looking for a work that speaks back to us and kind of tells us that we're not alone. We all are really unique. We all have different experiences. We all come from different backgrounds. And one use of literature, one value of literature is not that it has this kind of depth that we need to expose. It's that it actually has a surface. It's saying something that we haven't heard elsewhere. I think that's very different than this kind of notion of critique. There's a lot more there, and I just wanted to highlight that one point. Another scholar who I find really interesting is Michael Clune. Clune, in Writing Against Time, he resurrects this idea of literary immortality. It's kind of this old idea of, it goes back to Shakespeare's sonnets, and a lot of the romantic poets are invested in this idea that literature and art more generally, its purview is eternity rather than the present, right? The ephemeral, right? That the goal of art is to transcend history, transcend time, and this is a really compelling monograph, Writing Against Time, and it explores the ways that artists attempt to liberate themselves from their current moment. And then more recently, he wrote In Defense of Judgment, and this is a book that responds to literary scholars disavowing their responsibility to judge the merits and faults of a work. Like a lot of literary studies scholars coming out of cultural studies, it's not their job to determine that this is valuable and this is not valuable. It's not their job to curate as an expert, tell you that Harry Potter is bad and Harry Potter is bad and La Morte d'Arthur is good, The Death of Arthur is good. Both are fantastical, but one is literature and one is kind of not very good. Clune actually said, once again I'm using broad strokes, that we should think about how literary scholars are experts in aesthetic judgment, and they should lean into that expertise. It's a lot more there, but it's an interesting, I would say, a post-theory intellectual enterprise. Of course, even though people talk about after theory and post-theory, theory continues today in several forms. We've already talked about cultural studies and cultural theory and interdisciplinarity, but gender and sexuality studies, eco-criticism is a new theory, affect theory is it's about 10, 15 years old, maybe a little bit older than that. Surface reading is a buzzword that is being used now, but theory continues. It's not it's false advertising if people say we've entered a post-theory world. Maybe there's some movements away from theory, but theory is still very much present in literary studies. Now I want to move on to explore some of the key issues in literary theory and criticism, and this is actually Anne Stevens' approach in that chapter. She looks at literary form, literary characters. I paraphrase that as literature and psychology, the importance of context, the identity of the author, the role of the reader, reading as education, reading as entertainment, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have this diagram here. It's actually a pretty famous diagram in literary studies. It comes from this book, The Mirror and the Lamp, Romantic Theory and the Critical Tradition by M.H. Abrams. This book was published in 1971. M.H. Abrams, in the introduction, speculates on the different approaches to literature that there are. He tries to categorize all the different critical traditions, and this diagram it gets us to think about how we do tend to focus on things as literary critics, right? If you're a formalist, you're just looking at the work itself. If you really want to understand how poetry works as a form, you're focusing on the work itself. If you're a historicist and you want to learn about pre-modern drama, Shakespearean drama, and you're interested in how the architecture of the Globe Theater shaped the production of those plays, the historical context, you're focusing on something outside of the work. Perhaps you're interested in biography. We're reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for this class. So perhaps Mary Shelley's relationship with Percy Shelley, perhaps her relationship with her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, perhaps her experiences as a woman in the early 19th century. All of those things might be relevant but that would be a biographical criticism. Or maybe you're a reviewer. You want to say something that this is a good work or this is a bad work, or how did this work affect you? Anyhow, M.H. Abrams' diagram is very useful for letting us remember that there are certain emphases that we, there are certain emphases in our critical programs. Moving on, so just work our way through these very quickly. So focusing on literary form, if you're a critic that focuses on literary form, think about things like genre studies, tragedy, comedy, tragicomedy. How are those, when you discuss those things in a Shakespeare class, how the different plays are structured. You're doing and you're focusing on literary form. Poetry, the sonnet form, the villanelle, the ode, the epic, the elegy. Right? There are ways of talking about these specific forms. Or if you're looking at narrative, the novel, the short story. When we do analysis of character and setting and plot and conflict and resolution of tension and all those sorts of things. These are questions of literary form. And ultimately, we're concerned with, when you talk about literary form, you're concerned with how form and content interact. For example, can you ever separate form from content? Or does form and content braid in such a way that they can't be separated? Interesting conversation, but that's one of one of the areas of interest that literary theorists focus on. Literary characters in literature and psychology. I'm going to quote Stevens here. Literary criticism can help illuminate the ways in which literature teaches us about human nature, the inner workings of the mind, abnormal psychology, and related matters. And this insight, you can see why psychologists, psychotherapists, like clinicians even, right? These were clinicians, people who spoke with sick people and ill people and wanted to cure them of a psychological illness. Right? Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Jacques Lacan. I don't think Jameson was actually a clinical psychotherapist, nor was Slavoj Žižek or Judith Butler. These become more theorists in the tradition of psychoanalysis. But Freud, Jung, and Lacan definitely were, I would say physicians. Does that word work? I think maybe that works. But long story short, these ideas make their way into literature, into literary theory, because literary theory deals in a very intimate way with human psychology. There's a whole tradition of psychoanalytical literary criticism. Jameson is interesting because he has a concept called the political unconscious. And so where psychoanalysis usually is applied to individuals, right? The individual who's struggling with a problem in their life, Jameson is analyzing works of art, architecture, literature, popular culture, as if it's a manifestation of a sort of collective consciousness, right? Like that all works contain within them some sort of unconscious political hope or tension or conflict, right? Žižek does a lot of that. Žižek is famous for his relationship with Jacques Lacan. Lacan was I guess it's fair to say he was a student of Freud's work, but innovated a lot of Freud's work and revised it. Lacanian psychoanalysis is very different than Freudian psychoanalysis. We'll talk more about this later. But Žižek combines Lacanian psychoanalysis with Marxism. Judith Butler draws upon all sorts of discourses. One of them is psychoanalysis, feminist psychoanalysis, and she has been taken up by a school of literary theory called queer theory. By the way, so this is Sigmund Freud, this is Jacques Lacan, and this is Carl Jung. I just put there, and these are Jameson's book, The Political Unconscious, and Zizek's, this is the copy of The Sublime Objective Ideology that I own, the cover of the one that I own. But so moving on. Stevens also talks about how there is a focus on the importance of context. She states, reading a book not only can bring characters to life, literary critics who study works in their context do so for varied purposes. Using a text to better understand a historical period, for example, or conversely, using a historical period to better understand a text. There's a movement that we'll be talking about called the New Historicism. I'm not completely sure if the term came from this anthology of academic essays, but I'm inclined to think it did. Or maybe the term was being used in academic circles, and this anthology picked up on that and used it as the title. This editor, H. Aram Vieser, may be the publisher. But the term New Historicism refers to literary scholars returning to historical context that had been left behind for a while, to generalize. Not saying historicists ever completely went away, but there was this like renewed interest in historical context and how it can shed light on literature. Stephen Greenblatt was kind of a leader in this New Historicism movement, although he often claimed he wasn't a leader; he was doing his own thing. But what New Historicism is it's a return to history, and very much influenced by the work of Michel Foucault. And how does a Foucauldian understanding of history illuminate certain elements of a literary text? There's a lot there, but it's pretty interesting. Oh, there's also something I should mention: book history or print culture history. We tend to not think of literary text as being physical artifacts. Like, does the body of a text matter? And book historians and print culture historians will look at how the way texts are instantiated in a physical form shapes the way we interpret it, shapes the way we value them. Like, we will value a book with gold leaf, right, in a different way than a pulp magazine printed on acid-rich paper, newsprint, right, that decays pretty quickly and has like a garish cover and lots of advertisements inside. It's going to shape the way we interpret the literature published. But it's important of context and history. Moving on, this is a pretty bad slide, but I wanted to get this Foucault quote in here. Focusing on the identity of an author, generally speaking, biographical criticism. To what extent does knowing about the author's life illuminate the text? If you know about, I mentioned Mary Shelley, if you know about Mary Shelley's life, what are some things in the novel Frankenstein that you wouldn't have seen before you knew about Mary Shelley's life? To what extent can studying an author's life limit interpretation of a text? There's a critic, theorist named Roland Barthes who had this idea of the death of the author, and in his view, that if you kept the author's life in mind, there's a risk that it could limit what you can say about a text, that it actually stops you from being able to interpret creatively. And so, his essay, The Death of the Author, is an attempt to liberate us from the tyrannical presence of the author as we interpret text. So there's other, questions. What is the nature of an author? And this is where this really long quote comes in. Foucault writes an essay called What is an Author? It's very interesting, thoughtful, changes the way you think of authorship in general. I'm going to read this quote. He's exploring this question of what is an author. So we have our naive understanding of what an author is, and he says, the truth is quite the contrary. The author is not an indefinite source of significations or meaning which fill a work. The author does not precede the works. He is a certain function principle by which in our culture one limits, excludes, and chooses. In short, by which one impedes the free circulation, the free manipulation, the free composition, decomposition, and recomposition of fiction. In fact, if we are accustomed to presenting the author as a genius, as a perpetual surging of invention, it is because in reality we make him function in exactly the opposite fashion. Not as this surge of invention, but actually this limit to prescribe what we can say about a text. One can say that the author is an ideological product, since we represent him as the opposite of his historically real function. When a historically given function is represented in a figure that inverse is, one has an ideological production. The author is therefore the ideological figure by which one makes the manner in which we fear the proliferation of meaning. In saying this, I seem to call for a form of culture in which fiction would not be limited by the figure of the author. And Foucault is right. He starts to give us this several reminders about how authorship was different in previous periods. Right? You would have think about the figure of the balladeer, right, singing a folk ballad, going from town to town, reciting legends and folk myths, and are they the author? Are they the authority on these folk myths, or are they inheriting them from a tradition that maybe they can't claim ownership of? And who's really in charge at that point when people start singing along, or people correct you when you're the balladeer and you're telling the story and they say that's not how it happened, and then they share their version of it. So this idea of authorship is quite complicated. Moving on, we have concepts of the intentional fallacy. This comes from New Criticism in the 1930s. This is where we attempt to say, well, that's not what the author intended. You can't interpret a poem in that way because the author actually contradicted that notion in an interview or something. The intentional fallacy is that you're not allowed to refer to the author's intentions when interpreting texts. I feel like I've butchered that, but it's a little bit more sophisticated than I give the impression. It's first off, it's not so much a response to people referring to the author. It's a premise for how you should interpret poetry. The new critics are saying that you can't truly appreciate poetry if you're focusing on biography. You should focus on the poem as such. I talked about The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes. And then some bullets that I wanted to bring in were living authors in interviews. What is the role of an author interview? If you read a living author and they talk about a new novel and they say this and that about it, is that useful for an author? Should we use that? And then celebrity in authorship. Once an author has become a literary celebrity, does that change the way we interpret their work? Are we going to value their work differently if they're Stephen King or Toni Morrison or Pulitzer Prize winner? If they've won the Pulitzer Prize, are we just going to sit forward? Are we going to interpret it in a different way, for good or ill? So moving on, the role of the reader. This is an interesting element to focus on. What happens when readers read a text? What goes on in our brains? What is the nature of interpretation? What constitutes valid and invalid interpretations? Can we say to someone that your interpretation is wrong, and on what basis can we, there's a theory, a school of literary theory called reader response theory, and there's a scholar named Stanley Fish who is a big name in that world, and he has this idea that there is no such thing as a literary text. Literary text is what interpretive communities create. Right? When we talk about Mary Shelley, there's really nothing there. It's outside of any sort of conversation that we have about it. Our conversations about the text is what constitute the text. So he thinks that the role of the reader is extremely important. How do readers change literary history? Think about the rise of literacy in the early 20th century, the ubiquity of cheap print material. Is that going to change the way writers write? I think it does. And then what effects do literary works have on readers? Specifically, when we talk about, there's several genres where we talk about their emotional effect on us. Horror scares us. Melodrama makes us cry. Science fiction fills us with wonder. Right? There's a school of theory called affect theory, which is interested in how literature causes us to have an embodied reaction. Another interesting school is cognitive poetics. I don't think it's as widely known, where people will look at neurobiology and literary studies and they'll try to combine it. Think, maybe I'm butchering it, but reading James Joyce's Ulysses while in an fMRI machine and getting your brain scanned, right? And we can see how the brain responds to fiction, right? Does the brain respond to a fictional thunderstorm in the same way as an actual thunderstorm? That's an interesting question that maybe cognitive poetics people would look at. So last but not least is this reading as education versus reading as entertainment. This is a big issue. Main question is, to what extent should literature educate? Should literature make us better? And then how should literature educate? Should it be direct? Like George Orwell's 1984 is a political allegory, right? Is allegory, that's not direct, it's an indirect way of saying that totalitarianism is bad. Where Orwell also wrote literary journalism, where he specifically said totalitarianism is bad. So how should literature educate? In a more of a journalistic way, or are we okay with things like allegory, the indirect education? Also, is it the job of the critic to judge works on the basis of their pedagogical potential? This becomes interesting when you think about harmful art. Is there art that is harmful, and if it's harmful in this or that way, should we censure it as critics? This is our job to kind of put it out of mind, like not. I'll use an internet term. Should we boost the signal of that art if we know it has harmful elements? An interesting example that Stevens brings up is J.K. Rowling in the Harry Potter series, because the Harry Potter series, some would say that J.K. Rowling's stories of Hogwarts, it's just meant for entertainment, right? But Harold Bloom in the early aughts, I forget which publication it was in, that he lodged this critique, said that Harry Potter is bad because it's not challenging people, it's making people, it's dumbing down the readership, is his argument in a nutshell, right? And I would call that like a conservative critique, right? Literature should be challenging. Literature should make your neurons fire. It should make you think deeper about life and the human experience. So that's one critique. I'd say there's another critique, a more recent one, is this critique of J.K. Rowling because of her definition of what a woman is, right? And specifically, she was, I don't want to get this wrong, but I believe she said that trans women are not the same as actual women. And I would argue this is a progressive critique, right? It's coming from more of the left side of the political spectrum than the Harold Bloom's right side. And so, but both critiques, left and right, seem like they're coming from a position of, it's the responsibility of literary art to do something more than just entertain us. There is a person, Oscar Wilde, who would say to both, Harold Bloom and the internet critique that, you're taking J.K. Rowling too seriously. Art is quite useless, would say Oscar Wilde. Art is just meant to entertain, to bring delight, to distract, to pass the time. So, last one slide is another concern that is relevant is diversity, equity, and inclusion. How much of the literary canon is perpetuating, cultural homogeneity, things like racism, heteronormativity, even classist views of the other. The question, to what extent is literary history exclusionary? Of course, going back to the 1920s and 30s, and you look at what counts as the Western canon, it's very much exclusionary. It's lots of dead European males. So what is the role of the literary critic in literary theory in the context of literary canon? Is it the job of literary theory to open up the canon? Is that part of what we do when we're literary critics or literary theorists? Or this question, how has lack of diversity in the literary community, lack of privilege and education, and racism and other prejudices shaped the literary canon? A lot of the editors, a lot of the publishers, a lot of the critics that constituted the literary world were, of a certain background, right? And so they're going to champion a certain kind of work. And part, I think, of literary theory is unpacking how that legacy of cultural and ethnic homogeneity, principle of normativity has shaped the way we come to literature today. I have the Oxford Companion to African American Literature here, and Toni Morrison's famous Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination. It's just two examples of critical, one is a reference work and the other is a critical analysis of the Western canon from the point of view of African American studies. So all right, well, thank you very much. That was part 2 of introduction to literary criticism and theory. And yeah, have a good day.